Had you deployed anywhere before the Gulf War?
No, closest to deployment that we came, and it wasn't deployment. We did sometimes do our 2 weeks active duty at another Army hospital. Like we went to El Paso and we did a lot of field training during our 2 weeks active duty as well.
Yeah. So where was it then, or do you recall the time when it occurred to you that you might actually deploy? Because of course things begin to heat up in, I think it's 1990 when
1990,
Iraq
yes.
Iraq invades Kuwait.
Our unit got orders prohibiting people from retiring at, I think it was maybe in August of 1990. And that was the first little clue, but we still, yeah, we were a huge 1,000-bed hospital with so many personnel, which is the reason I chose that reserve unit, because we were told nobody's going to deploy such a huge unit.
Was it a process of, well, we're probably not going to deploy to, we might deploy, well, it looks like we're going to deploy, or okay, now we know we're going to deploy. Was it that kind of gradual process?
No, it was a phone call kind of out of the blue that we had been activated right before Thanksgiving. And it just shook me to my core.
How many how many kids did you have at that time?
I had three,
And how old were they?
8, 7, and 2.
Oh boy. Wow. So just talk about that. I mean, deployment, lead this is an open-ended deployment, right? We don't know how long we're going to be deployed. Is that right?
Correct.
Yeah. So it's open-ended. We don't know when we're coming home. Before the Gulf War begins, when we don't know how things are going to unfold, I remember hearing people on TV talking about how skillful the Iraqi army was and how many American body bags there would be, and that this is going to be a very tough war. So we go into it, not there's debate about the extent to which this is going to be a difficult war. So there's that to think about. So we don't know how long we're going to be deployed. We don't know how serious this war is going to be. And then on top of that, you have three young children, one of them 2 years old. How much time did you have to pull everything together before you were deployed?
We actually had a lot of training time down at Fort Lewis, but we went down to Fort Lewis right after Thanksgiving. And we were living and training down there. And, they let us come home for uh, occasional weekends, and we came home for Christmas, which
Mm.
was nice.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, every time we came home, we had to say goodbye again, thinking that this was probably going to be our last time home. So we had really probably too much time because it was so hard to keep saying goodbye to our families.
I can imagine. Well, what was the plan? Who was going to step in to, I mean, not take your place, that's not possible, but to maybe fill in the gap a little bit.
We had an incredible support system through the school that my daughters attended. I was very actively involved in their schooling, and it was a cooperative, so parents volunteered in the classrooms, and we got to know other parents and knew the friends of our kids. And I was like the token soldier from our school, and the school just really gathered around my family and provided meals for them and offered assistance. My husband dropped the kids off up the street, and one mom got the girls ready to go to school, and another person did daycare for my son for 12 hours while my husband was gone.
Yeah.
So it was pretty incredible. And our parents, of course, did as much as they could, but they had their own lives as well, but they came up for a while too.
Yeah. And then I want to jump ahead to when you come home, and I think I've seen a photo of you involved in a yellow ribbon cutting thing, and there was so much celebration because the predictions of a very tough war that had not panned out. It had been a short and costly war. There were casualties, lives were lost, but certainly compared to Vietnam, compared to the Iraq War to follow, compared to Afghanistan, it was, I don't want to use the word easy, but nothing, no other word comes to mind, but,
It
relatively speaking.
in hindsight, it was easy. The anticipation of what we would be facing was a nightmare. The briefings that we received that, they're going to use chemical weapons,
Right.
and if they get Israel involved, it could be a holy war that we'd be in the middle of. And the number of casualties that they were expecting was just amazing. So we were pretty terrified going into it.
You come home, you experience this outpouring from the population. There are parades, there are the yellow ribbons. Even I just have in front of me, pins that, came out at the time, welcome home pins, Desert Storm, victory. Here's a patch, Operation Desert Storm, mission accomplished. And I'm bringing this up, partly just to remind us of this historical moment um, and what you remember about that. But I wanted to ask you this question because I talk a lot to Vietnam veterans, to veterans of the conflict in Afghanistan, to veterans of Iraq. Um, and a common difficulty they have is stating what their wars were about, even really knowing what the mission was. And just the incredible hardship of that, of going through warfare, of being in a war zone, of dealing with the stresses of that, of experiencing combat or seeing the effects of combat. And this most fundamental question, why are we here? We're finding it increasingly difficult to answer that question. And I'm wondering, so all of that is to get to the question that in retrospect, when we see that the Gulf War, it had a clear objective, get Iraq out of Kuwait. We knew, we knew what the issue was. We knew when the goal had been accomplished. And as the patch says, mission accomplished, unambiguous. Now, at least as far as that conflict goes, as far as Iraq goes, complications remain. But so to come to the question then, as you look back on that conflict, how significant is it? How important is it? Does it matter at all that the war did have a clear mission, that when the mission was accomplished, getting Iraq out of Kuwait, then the war is over, at least, in terms of Operation Desert Storm, and also the tremendous support that you had from the public, both before and after. And I'm assuming during the conflict, you're seeing the stuff that's being sent from people, from the country, the packages, the letters, to any soldier, to any airman, to any Marine, etc. What difference does that make psychologically when you can look back at your conflict and say, the mission was clear, the mission was accomplished, we came home, and the population appreciated us?
I think that probably did make a huge difference, that we knew we were going over there because Kuwait was being bullied and invaded by Iraq.
Where were you based?
We were in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia.
And what was your role? At this time, you were a major?
I was a major, yes. I was a staff nurse on our prisoner of war ward. just taking care of Iraqi prisoners, which was an interesting experience.
When you think about those Iraqi prisoners, I'm sure you can bring some to your mind. What memories do you have of them?
Um, we had some pretty severe injuries that required amputated limbs and an eye enucleation from shrapnel and abdominal injuries from shrapnel. Um, we had guards stationed outside their doors, and I initially was really afraid to take care of Iraqi prisoners because I'd heard, the Republican Guard and everything, but
Right.
these guys were grateful to have a bed and 3 meals a day. And many of them had been at war since the Iran-Iraq war and had not been home, but they were at war because Saddam threatened their families. So it it kind of enlightened me about our so-called enemy who really didn't want to be there, and we're getting a lot better care in our hospital than, we kind of wondered what would happen to them when they had to go home.
So was your general sense that these Iraqi prisoners that you were caring for, that are they're wounded, they've been picked up from the battlefield, and I imagine there's a range of wounds. Your general sense was that most of them were relieved to, I mean, obviously not to be wounded, but to be out of the conflict. Was that something you picked up from them?
I don't know if they were relieved, but they were grateful that they were being treated humanely. And, we didn't speak their language. So
Sure.
whatever information we got from them was through a Saudi interpreter. So it was
Hmm.
maybe the Saudi person, distorted the interpretation a little bit. But, we gave them a Valentine's Day, and they had no idea what Valentine's Day was, but we brought candy in for them, and they were happy to be where they were, I think.
Yeah.
Although, some of them were very gravely injured and it was going to impact the rest of their life.
Did you see your nursing work as not only, tending to the wounds they had, but did you, find yourself having a longer range view of not only do we want to patch this person up to the extent we can, but are you doing a kind of outreach as well? Like here's one way to heal not only the physical wounds of war, but to heal the wounds of war in a broader sense. Maybe a way of, kind of bringing the peoples together.
Definitely, definitely. And public relations for the US too, that,
Right.
hey, we're not bad guys.
Do you have any particular memories of um, Iraqis that you interacted with? I know you're not able to speak with most of them, or maybe to speak with all of them, but as you, look back on those months, do you, is there a particular Iraqi or two that especially sticks out in your memory?
We had one that, yeah, had all of his extremities basically shattered and one leg amputated. So yeah, he was well cared for, and kind of beloved by all of the staff.
Did you work only with American personnel, or were there personnel from other countries that you worked with as well?
There were some expats at the hospital too that had and some Saudi Arabian physicians. I don't think there were any nurses from Saudi, but quite a few nurses from the Philippines. I think we had one from Scotland. On so yeah, there were a variety.
Yeah. One of the things we remember about the Gulf War And you mentioned it earlier, is concern about chemical warfare, and which I don't think that is realized, but the Scud missiles and Iraq, Saddam Hussein sending Scud missiles toward Israel and that. Did you experience any of that?
We
That
did.
Scud missiles coming in?
Yes, we did. One of the pictures I sent you was over Riyadh of a Patriot intercepting a Scud. And yeah, we had Scud alerts, usually at night. I think always at night. Not every night, but if sometimes there were a couple a night. And, we would put on our helmets and our gas masks initially until we became more complacent about it.
Hmm.
And our chemical team had to go out and test the air to make sure that there hadn't been chemicals on the Scud. There was one night that a huge explosion woke me up in the middle of the night. And it was like, oh my gosh, we're being bombed. And woke up my roommate and we put our helmets and everything on. And
Oh,
it was just it had been intercepted by a Patriot, but it was apparently right overhead. So
wow. What was the protocol? I mean, um, if you're working on a patient, for example, and an alert goes that a scud is incoming, what's the protocol? Do you just keep working, or how do you respond to that?
well, most of the things were at night, so people were generally sleeping, well, other than the night shift at the hospital, but
Hmm.
they actually had uh, I think they had a bomb shelter in the downstairs of the hospital, but we never evacuated anybody down there. We just, kind of waited to see if there were chemicals being used, and if there were, then we would put on our full gear.
And you had the chemical suit nearby, I'm assuming all the time.
Yeah, we had to, even when we were in civilian clothes on days off, we had to carry our gas mask with us.
Wow.
And the chemical suits, initially we carried with us all the time, and then it was just kind of too much.
How long were you in country altogether, or how long were you deployed altogether?
Our deployment was actually 4 months, but that's counting our time at Fort Lewis. So it was very short.
So how, once the conflict gets going, how long do you think it was before you realized that this is a conflict that's probably going to get wrapped up pretty quickly? That what we were hearing before the war about, a very, severe conflict, at least for U.S. and allied forces, that was not going to pan out.
It didn't take very long before we realized that there weren't chemicals on the Scuds, and we heard that Iraqis were, surrendering right and left. Basically, as soon as they heard a noise, they were surrendering. So
Sure.
it didn't take long to realize that it would be over pretty quickly.
One of the things that I recall from the Gulf War is that during the war, there were drives everywhere, to send letters and packages and cookies and all kinds of stuff. And veterans of the Gulf War just have memories of being inundated with stuff that's coming from the States, which is showing, community support. Did you see some of that yourself?
I saw a lot just from my family and friends and the kids' school. The teachers would send packages with messages from all the kids and pictures of what they were doing in the classrooms. And yeah, I decorated my wall with pictures that my kids and other kids sent.
What do you remember about the whole process of coming home and the welcome from the community?
It was pretty amazing. The crowds at the airfield when we landed, and all the American flags and signs welcoming us home. And there was uh, band playing and a big reception where the governor, thanked us for our service.
When you think about your deployment to Saudi Arabia during the Gulf War, I wonder if there are a few memories that most stand out in your mind. As time goes by, there's sometimes an editing process in our as we think back in our lives, and there are certain memories that stand out as particularly important. And I wonder if when you look back on your service during the Gulf War, are there a few memories that are especially important to you?
Well, traumatic memories of saying goodbye to my family there was one of our corpsmen who made a comment to me when he saw my kids and my husband and me in tears, sorry. And he said, "Your family was my Gulf War moment,"
Mm,
because everybody was, and I still,
sure.
so that was pretty awful. And all the briefings that just made it look like we were going on a suicide mission. It was pretty horrible. The first day of the war over there, because we were over there before the war actually started. And the first day of the war, they said, "Okay, it's starting. Everybody needs to put on all your chemical gear." So we all put on our full protective gear and our gas masks and went out of our rooms and sat in the hallway, just sitting there
Wow.
waiting to see if we were going to get attacked. And that was kind of a surreal moment. And it was interesting trying to play cards or whatever with our gloves, and we were thinking, man, how are we going to start an IV or do whatever we're supposed to do when we have all this chemical gear on. I didn't talk that much about my feelings or anything after the war, but just kind of, being a reserve unit, we didn't go through, we went through, just our exit stuff, and then we all went home and and got right back into working in the school and going to work and taking care of a family of five. And it was a difficult transition for me. It's just, it's so different coming back into civilian life and just trying to get back to normal when you're really not quite the same person anymore.
You discussed the difficulty of saying goodbye to your family as you deployed. Um, Having been in a context of war, and now you're saying goodbye to Lauren as she's about to deploy. Um, how would you compare, contrast those experiences?
Once I was over there and deployed, I knew I was fine, and it was not it was not so traumatic for me. Once that initial fear of the unknown was past. But saying goodbye to Lauren and going to Afghanistan was horrible. Yeah, because I had just heard so many horrible things about Afghanistan, and she was going off to um, a remote province,
And
not a protected city.
and although you did not know how long you were going to deploy, it turns out to be a relatively short deployment. But I think going into Lauren's deployment, you know that it's going to be a year-long deployment, right? There,
I think it was a 9 month deployment, but
9 month
but
deployment.
she had 3 months of training beforehand.
So she's going into a 9 month deployment, and I'm assuming, from as a parent, then I mean, each day brings its own little anxiety as we're ticking away the days on those 9 months.
Yeah, and every time you hear something on the news, but yeah, and there was I sent weekly packages and always went to the same person at the post office, and she'd always say, "Oh, I'm praying for your daughter."
Yeah.
So, and from that perspective, it was much, much harder for me to have her deployed than for me to be deployed.